Welcome back. Today I want to take you to the Adirondacks in the summer of 1906, to a place that looks peaceful in photographs and postcards, but became the center of one of the most famous murder trials of the early 20th century. This is the story of Grace Brown and Chester Gillette, a case that still raises arguments more than 100 years later. Was it a planned killing? A terrible accident followed by panic and selfishness? Let's walk through what happened. Grace Brown was a young woman from a farming family in South Otselic, New York. Like a lot of young women at the time, she left home for work, and in 1905, she moved to Cortland to take a job at the Gillette Skirt Company. It was steady factory work, not glamorous, but it meant independence and a paycheck. That's where she met Chester Gillette. Chester came from a more comfortable world. He was connected to the owners of the company. He dressed well, and he seemed to move easily in social circles that were closed off to women like Grace. Grace, on the other hand, was known as quiet and hardworking, and before long, they began a relationship that they kept out of sight. In that era, secrecy wasn't just about romance. It was about survival. Reputation mattered a lot, and by the spring of 1906, Grace realized she was pregnant. That single fact changed everything. Suddenly, the relationship wasn't just private. It was dangerous for her, socially and economically. Grace started writing Chester letters. Not casual notes, please. She begged him to marry her, or at least to acknowledge what was happening. You can hear the fear in the situation even without reading her exact words. She's imagining being sent away, being shamed, being left to raise a child alone in a society that didn't forgive unmarried mothers. Chester's life was moving in the opposite direction. He was spending time with women from higher social classes, showing up at parties, keeping one foot in a world where Grace didn't belong. And he wasn't offering her the one thing she believed could make this right: marriage. Then, in early July, Chester came to see her. On July 8th, 1906, he convinced Grace to go on a trip with him. She believed it was leading to a wedding. She packed a small suitcase and told her family she was leaving to become a wife. Just imagine that moment. How much hope she must have had, how much she needed to believe him. The two of them traveled through upstate New York and checked into hotels using false names. That detail would matter later because it suggests planning and secrecy. Though, of course, some people might argue it was simply an attempt to avoid gossip. Either way, they were hiding in plain sight. On July 11th, they arrived at Big Moose Lake, a quiet Adirondack destination surrounded by forest. That afternoon, Chester rented a rowboat. He and Grace went out onto the lake together, and only Chester returned. Chester's explanation was that it was an accident. He said Grace stood up, the boat tipped, and it capsized. Grace couldn't swim. Chester claimed he tried to help her, but she slipped beneath the water. Now here's where the story turned sharply. Instead of immediately raising an alarm, instead of running for help and shouting that someone was drowning, Chester made it to shore and then walked away. He later checked into another hotel under his real name. Grace's body was discovered the next day. Investigators examined Grace and found bruises on her face. Medical experts suggested those injuries could have been caused by a blow from something blunt. And that led prosecutors to a chilling possibility: that Grace hadn't simply drowned after an accident. She may have been struck. One object that drew attention was a tennis racket Chester had brought along. The prosecution argued it could have been used as a weapon. They also pointed out that the boat didn't show obvious damage that would explain a sudden, unavoidable capsize. Then there was Chester's behavior after Grace died. Witnesses described him as unusually calm, not like someone who had just watched a companion drown in front of him. That's not proof on its own, of course. People react to trauma in different ways. But in a courtroom, especially in 1906, demeanor could be persuasive. And looming over all of it were Grace's letters. Dozens of them. The letters created a narrative the jury could follow: a frightened young woman trying to force a commitment, and a young man who seemed determined to escape responsibility. Prosecutors argued that Grace's pregnancy gave Chester a motive: avoid scandal, avoid marriage, avoid the social consequences that could come from being tied to a factory worker from a farming family. Chester took the stand in his own defense. He stuck to the story that the drowning was an accident, and he admitted he fled afterward, but said he panicked. His lawyers challenged the physical evidence, arguing that bruises might have come from the boat itself or from debris in the water. And they leaned hard on a central problem. No one else was in that boat. No one witnessed a blow. No one saw a push. No confession came later. It was a case built largely on circumstance, behavior, and motive. The trial became a national spectacle. Newspapers treated it like front-page drama, and they published Grace's letters for the public to read, which only intensified the emotional reaction. Chester's every move in court was described and judged, and public opinion, once it turned fast. When the jury finally deliberated, it took less than 4 hours. On December 4th, 1906, they found Chester Gillette guilty of murder. He was executed by electrocution on March 30th, 1908. Until the end, he maintained that Grace's death was accidental, though he did acknowledge something like moral responsibility, an admission that to many people sounded like too little and far too late. Grace Brown's story didn't end with the verdict. In many ways, it grew larger than the courtroom. People saw the case as a symbol of class imbalance, of gendered vulnerability, and of how few options women had when relationships were secret and power was uneven. In 1925, Theodore Dreiser turned a fictionalized version of this story into the novel An American Tragedy, which became a major cultural landmark. Later adaptations, like A Place in the Sun, kept the themes alive for new audiences. And Grace's letters, so personal and so raw, became some of the most famous pieces of early American true crime history. And yet, for all the attention, there are still questions that won't go away. Did Chester actually strike Grace? Was the trip to Big Moose Lake arranged with murder in mind? Could the boat really have tipped in a way that looks suspicious in hindsight, but was simply bad luck? And those bruises, were they proof of an attack? Or could they truly have come from the chaos of a drowning? The frustrating truth is that the case has gaps that time can't fill. There were no eyewitnesses. There was no definitive forensic breakthrough waiting in the wings. The jury had to weigh motives and choices and behavior, all filtered through the moral expectations of the early 1900s. That's why historians and legal scholars still argue about it. Was Chester a calculated killer or a coward who made unforgivable decisions after an accident? But no matter where you land, Grace Brown remains at the center of the tragedy. A young woman with limited power trying to secure a future in a world that offered her very few protections. Murder or accident, she was vulnerable long before she ever stepped into that boat. Thanks for listening today. If you want more stories like this, cases where history, culture, and human choices collide, follow the show, leave a rating, or subscribe wherever you listen. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.